I stood in my kitchen on Thanksgiving morning, staring at a table set for 17 people who never came. The turkey had been out of the oven for 2 hours, the skin turning dull and wrinkled as it cooled. The mashed potatoes were stiffening in their bowl. The rolls I had baked from scratch using my late wife's recipe were sitting in a basket under a checkered dish towel, exactly the way she used to leave them. I was standing there, leaning against the counter, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, still expecting someone to walk through that door at any minute. The house was painfully quiet. Nobody called. Not one of them. And that was the exact moment, the precise night, when something inside my chest finally stopped hurting and started deciding. My name is Bernard Owens. I am 67 years old. I spent 38 years building a life in Connecticut with my wife, Margaret. We raised 3 children, ran a small residential construction company for 3 decades, and built what I thought was a legacy. Then, I buried the woman I loved after watching breast cancer take her from me, piece by piece, over 24 agonizing months. What happened after the funeral is the story I need to tell, because I know there are thousands of older men and women sitting in quiet houses right now, wondering why the families they poured their blood and sweat into have suddenly forgotten they exist. Margaret and I met in the spring of 1984. She was a 3rd-grade teacher with a laugh that could fill up a room, and I was running a 2-man framing crew out of a beat-up Ford pickup truck. We were not wealthy, and we certainly were not fancy, but we were good together. We built something solid from the ground up. Over the years, that life grew. We bought a home in a quiet, tree-lined Connecticut neighborhood. We raised 3 kids we were fiercely proud of. My construction company grew from 2 guys framing sheds to 14 men building custom homes. Looking back, I can see the dynamic that formed early on, the invisible structure of our family that I did not fully understand until it collapsed. Margaret was the emotional core of our household. In the language of psychologists, she was the family's kin-keeper. She was the one who remembered the birthdays, bought the presents, organized the Sunday dinners, and smoothed over the inevitable frictions between siblings. I was the provider. I worked 60-hour weeks, managed payroll, poured concrete, and came home exhausted but satisfied, knowing my family wanted for nothing. I thought writing the checks for college tuition, covering the down payments on their first homes, and making sure nobody had a mountain of debt was the ultimate expression of my love. I threw money at problems, and Margaret wrapped everything in warmth. Without her, I was a foundation without a house. Our oldest son, Philip, grew up sharp, analytical, and highly driven. He got into software engineering, moved to Boston, and made very good money very quickly. He married Sandra, a senior loan officer at a regional bank who always carried herself as though she were the most organized, important person in any room. Our middle son, Nolan, was quieter. He became a high school history teacher, married a woman named Karen, and stayed closer to home. Our daughter, Irene, the youngest, was always the emotional weather vane of the house. She had big feelings about everything, required the most reassurance, and married a man named Dale, who was always trying to get one business or another off the ground. When Margaret was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer in the spring of 2012, the entire world stopped spinning. I will not walk through every detail of those 2 years, because some grief is too heavy to put into words, even now. But I will tell you that it broke me down to the studs. I scaled back the construction business entirely, handing day-to-day operations to my foreman with strict instructions to only call me if the lumberyard was on fire. I became Margaret's shadow. I drove her to chemotherapy twice a week. I memorized her complex medication schedules the way I used to memorize architectural blueprints. I learned how to lift her into the shower on the days her bones ached too much to stand. And I learned how to wash her hair without making her feel like she was losing her dignity. I slept with one ear open for 2 years, always listening for the sound of her struggling to breathe in the dark. The kids came when they could. Philip flew in from Boston a handful of times, always checking his watch. Nolan stopped by on weekends when his teaching schedule allowed. Irene called often and visited maybe once a month. I never held it against them. I told myself they had demanding jobs, mortgages, and young children of their own. I was not keeping score. It was Margaret and me against the world, the same way it had always been. Oh, she passed away on a Tuesday morning in March of 2014. She was 64 years old, and I was holding her hand when her chest stopped rising. The funeral was overflowing. Margaret had taught 3rd grade in that town for 30 years, and she had touched more lives than I could ever count. Over 300 people packed the church. My 3 kids were there with their spouses and all 6 of our grandchildren. Philip's wife, Sandra, took charge of coordinating the reception, directing the caterers, and organizing the floral arrangements. I was genuinely grateful for her efficiency, because I was completely hollowed out. I was barely surviving each hour. The night after the funeral, when the extended family had gone back to their hotels, and it was just my children left in my living room, Philip put his hand on my shoulder. He looked me right in the eye and told me that we were going to get through this together. He promised that they would take care of me, that we would remain a tight family. Nolan nodded in agreement. Irene wept into my chest. I believed every single word they said. I had absolutely no reason not to. For the first few months, the illusion of closeness held up. Philip called every couple of days. Nolan came over on Sunday mornings to mow the lawn, stepping up just as I used to do for my own father without being asked. Irene checked in daily, and Sandra even organized a meal train with the neighbors so I would not have to worry about cooking. We were pulling together through a shared trauma. But as the seasons changed, the shifts began. They were small at first. The phone calls from Philip dropped from twice a week to once a week, to maybe once a month. Nolan's lawn mowing visits stretched out until he stopped coming altogether, citing grading papers or weekend trips with his wife's family. Irene's conversations grew brief and distracted. I told myself not to be the needy, burdensome father. I told myself that the sting of Margaret's death was making them pull away from the house because everything inside it reminded them of her. I gave them space. I threw myself back into my business, trying to figure out what a solitary life looked like. But the distance only widened. That first Thanksgiving without Margaret, I naturally assumed we would be together. We had always rotated holidays, but we had always been in the same room. 2 weeks before the holiday, I called Philip. He cleared his throat and explained that he and Sandra were keeping it very small this year, just hosting her parents and her sister's family. He said it had been a hard year, and they just needed a quiet day. I swallowed the lump in my throat and told him I understood. I called Nolan. He apologized quickly, saying they were heading upstate to Karen's parents' house, but maybe we could see each other for Christmas. I called Irene. She promised she would try to stop by my house on Thanksgiving evening with the grandkids for pie. She never showed up, and she never called to cancel. I made myself a single plate of food that afternoon, and sat alone at a dining table that used to seat 12. I convinced myself it was an anomaly, a byproduct of fresh grief. But it did not get better. By year 2, I was practically begging to be included. I offered to host Christmas, promising to cook the prime rib, string the lights, and make the house feel magical again for the grandchildren. Philip told me they had already committed to Sandra's family. Nolan took his kids out of state to a ski lodge. Irene sent a text message on Christmas morning that simply read, "Thinking of you, Dad. Merry Christmas." I sat in the living room with 6 beautifully wrapped presents stacked under a glowing tree. The silence in the house was deafening. After 3 days, I loaded the presents into my truck and dropped them off at a local church toy drive. By year 3, the exclusion became visual. I had created a Facebook account to keep up with the grandkids, only to find myself staring at photo albums of massive family gatherings I was never told about. There were photos of Philip, Nolan, and Irene, all their spouses, all 6 of my grandchildren, and even Margaret's sister, all laughing in Philip's backyard for a summer barbecue. I was the only piece of the family missing. It was as if I had been quietly erased from the narrative of their lives. As the years ground on, their neglect transitioned from emotional distance to sheer physical abandonment. In the 4th year, during a bitter February freeze, I slipped on black ice in my driveway and fractured my wrist. I sat in the emergency room, my arm throbbing, and called Philip. He listened, said it sounded incredibly painful, and told me he would try to swing by later that week to check on me. He never came. I spent 6 weeks struggling to open jars, button my shirts, and sleep upright in a recliner because lying flat was too painful. Not one of my 3 children drove across town to help their 63-year-old father. You might wonder about the grandchildren during this time. I used to wonder too. Why didn't the older ones call their grandfather? But, as I learned later, teenagers are easily distracted by their own lives, and their access to me was entirely gate-kept by their parents. If Philip and Sandra didn't mention me, if Nolan didn't bring me up, the kids simply forgot. When I found out my oldest grandson, Danny, had been accepted into a prestigious regional academic honors program during year 5, I didn't hear it from Philip. I read it in a local community newspaper. I immediately mailed Danny a handwritten card telling him how deeply proud I was, along with a check for $500. A week later, I received a 3-word text from him. "Thanks, Grandpa." I never heard another word about it. Year 7 was the moment my denial began to crack. I drove 2 hours to surprise Nolan on his birthday. I had baked his favorite chocolate cake from scratch, spending the entire morning getting the frosting exactly the way Margaret used to make it. When I pulled up to his house, the street was lined with cars. I could hear music and laughter bleeding through the front windows. I walked up to the porch holding the cake box and knocked. Nolan opened the door. The moment he saw me, the blood drained from his face and his jaw tightened. "Dad, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low, as if I were a stranger trespassing on his property. "It's your birthday," I smiled weakly, holding up the box. "I brought your cake." Nolan glanced nervously over his shoulder back into the warmth of the hallway. "This is really just a thing with Karen's family, Dad. It's not a great time." He did not invite me inside. He took the cake, set it on a patio chair, and practically closed the door in my face. I walked back to my truck, my hands shaking. I had to pull onto the shoulder of the highway twice on the drive home because my vision was too blurred with tears to see the road. What made their abandonment so incredibly hard to swallow was the secret I was keeping. During all those years of silence, all those missed holidays and unreturned phone calls, I was quietly bailing my children out of financial ruin. When Philip and Sandra hit a wall and fell 4 months behind on their mortgage, They didn't know how they were going to survive. I arranged to cover the payments through a third-party holding company set up by my lawyer, Clifford Nash, making it look like a quiet bank hardship grant. When Nolan's youngest daughter needed a dental surgery that his teacher's insurance refused to cover, I paid the massive gap anonymously directly to the hospital's billing office. When Irene's husband Dale desperately needed capital for a landscaping business that was bleeding money, I became an anonymous angel investor through a trust. They eagerly took every single dollar, never once questioning the miracles that repeatedly saved them. They felt entirely entitled to their good fortune. But entitlement eventually mutates into greed. In year 8, I discovered exactly who my daughter-in-law, Sandra, really was. I received a phone call from my bank's branch manager on a Tuesday afternoon. He told me he was calling as a courtesy. A woman identifying herself as a concerned family member had contacted the bank, aggressively inquiring about the status of my accounts. She wanted to know if I had updated estate planning documents on file, what my liquid assets looked like, and who the designated beneficiaries were. The manager refused to give her information, but he thought I should know. I sat at my kitchen table for an hour, my blood running cold. I knew Philip did not make that call. He was too passive for that kind of calculated maneuvering. It was Sandra. Sandra, who always thought 3 moves ahead. Sandra, who used to casually ask me at the few dinners we shared what the commercial property in town was worth, or what my timeline was for stepping away from the construction business. I picked up the phone and called Clifford Nash, my attorney and trusted friend of 25 years. I told him what happened. Clifford did not gasp or act shocked. He simply told me to document everything. I wrote down the date, the time, and the exact words of the bank manager. I put it in a fireproof safe. A few weeks later, my suspicions were confirmed. I was actually invited to Philip's house for a rare Sunday dinner. After the meal, I excused myself to get a glass of water from the kitchen. As I stood by the sink, I heard Philip and Sandra whispering fiercely in the adjacent hallway. "We need a clearer picture of what your dad actually has before things get complicated," Sandra hissed. "If his mind starts going, or if he needs a care facility, his assets are going to get drained. We need to know what we're dealing with regarding the estate." "I don't know, San. It feels wrong," Philip mumbled. "Just let me handle it," she replied coldly. I stood in the kitchen, perfectly still. I drank my water, walked back out to the living room, and smiled as I said my goodbyes. But the fog had completely lifted. I was not just a grieving widower to them anymore. I was awaiting inheritance. They had no interest in my life, but they were deeply invested in my death. Year 9 broke me. My grandson Danny was graduating from high school. Despite everything, I wanted to be there. I called Irene, who assured me she would put my name on the family guest list. I drove 3 hours across the state, wearing the good blazer I had worn to my own children's graduations. I even stopped at a bakery and bought a massive box of imported pastries, just like Margaret used to do. When I walked up to the school auditorium, Sandra was standing out front, holding a clipboard and directing her family members. She spotted me walking across the concrete. Her face hardened into a mask. She marched out to meet me halfway. "Dad," she said, using a tone reserved for a confused child. "Today is really just for the immediate family. We only got a handful of tickets for the reserved section. Nobody told you?" I stared at her. "Irene told me to come." Sandra didn't blink. There must have been a miscommunication. "I'm so sorry you drove all this way. You understand, right? There simply aren't enough seats." I looked past her shoulder. Through the glass lobby doors, I could see Nolan laughing with a group of parents. I saw my grandchildren taking photos. I looked down at the box of pastries in my hands. I looked back at Sandra's cold, unyielding eyes. "Sure, Sandra," I whispered. "I understand perfectly." I walked back to my truck, set the pastries on the passenger seat, and drove to the far edge of the parking lot. I turned off the engine, pulled out my smartphone, and opened the voice memo app. For 40 uninterrupted minutes, I talked. I recorded everything. I detailed the abandoned holidays, the missed medical emergencies, the secret financial bailouts, the bank manager's phone call, and the conversation I overheard in the hallway. I laid out a decade of betrayal. When I was finished, I saved the file, put the truck in gear, and drove home. I didn't shed a single tear. Crying requires hope. I was entirely out of hope. That brings me back to where this story started. Year 10, Thanksgiving. Even after the graduation incident, some deeply ingrained, foolish part of my paternal soul wanted to give them one final chance to redeem themselves. I called all 3 of them. I didn't hint. I begged. I told them I had been alone for a decade of holidays. I asked for just one meal together. Philip said he would try. Nolan said probably. Irene said it sounded lovely. I spent 3 days cooking. I set the table for 17, and as the clock struck 5, then 6, then 8 o'clock, and the candles burned down to puddles of wax on my good tablecloth, the final thread snapping in my mind was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I sat in the silent dining room until midnight. I walked into my office, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and wrote 2 words in thick black ink. No more. At 9 o'clock the next morning, I walked into Clifford Nash's office without an appointment. I sat down across the heavy mahogany desk and told him everything. I played him the voice memo. I handed him the documentation of Sandra's bank snooping. I laid out the financial ledgers of the secret bailouts. Clifford listened, his hands steepled under his chin. When I finished, the silence in the room was heavy. "Oh, what do you want to do, Bernard?" he asked softly. "I want to sell the company," I said, my voice steady. "I want to sell the commercial property. I want to sell the house. I want to liquidate every asset, restructure everything into accounts they cannot find, and I want to disappear. And I want it done so cleanly, so legally ironclad, that when Sandra inevitably comes hunting for my money, she hits a solid brick wall." Clifford smiled, a slow, predatory attorney's smile. "That is entirely within your rights. Let's get to work." The next 3 months were a whirlwind of quiet, calculated dismantling. Selling a 30-year legacy is an incredibly heavy emotional burden. When I signed the paperwork to sell the construction company to a regional developer for $1.4 million, I thought about the days I spent framing roofs in the blazing sun, coming home covered in sawdust to feed my infant sons. When I sold the commercial retail strip for $620,000, I thought about Margaret proudly cutting the ribbon when we first bought it. The house went on the market in late February and sold in 18 days to a young couple expecting a baby. Handing over those keys felt like slicing away a part of my soul. But it was a necessary amputation. Under Clifford's guidance, we built an impenetrable financial fortress. We compiled a notarized, heavily documented dossier of every single dollar I had secretly gifted my children over the decade. If they ever tried to claim I was suffering from dementia or being exploited, This document would prove I had been fully lucid and overwhelmingly generous. Then I did the only thing that gave me true peace. I set up 6 ironclad educational trusts for my grandchildren. The money would unlock when they turned 25, bypassing their parents completely. Inside each trust file, I left a sealed, handwritten letter for each grandchild. I didn't write with anger. I simply told them the truth about my side of the story, explaining why I had to leave, so that when they were old enough to ask questions, their parents couldn't twist the narrative. I packed my life into the bed of my pickup truck. I donated the antique furniture, the good china, and the memories. The hardest part was dismantling my woodworking shop in the garage. Margaret used to sit on a stool out there on Saturday mornings, drinking coffee and laughing while I built cabinets. I ran my hands over the scarred wood of my workbench one last time before loading my tools. On a crisp Friday morning in March, exactly 11 years after Margaret passed, I changed my phone number, forwarded my mail to Clifford's office, and drove out of Connecticut without looking in the rearview mirror. I drove 22 hours straight to Sarasota, Florida. Margaret and I had always dreamed of retiring near the water. I bought a modest, single-story house in a quiet neighborhood with a detached garage perfect for my tools. But I won't lie to you and say it was instant paradise. The first few weeks were brutally hard. When you spend 10 years conditioned to wait for a phone call, the absence of waiting feels like a terrifying vacuum. I had to learn how to wake up and realize the day belonged entirely to me. I had to learn how to exist without the low-level hum of anxiety in my chest. Slowly, I found my footing. I joined a local fishing club filled with retired men who appreciated the quiet just as much as I did. We went out on the water before dawn, trading stories and finding camaraderie. I started building furniture again in the evenings, letting the rhythm of the sandpaper quiet my mind. I was healing. 3 months after I left, the storm broke. Clifford called me on a secure line. "Philip has been to my office," Clifford said, sounding thoroughly amused. "Sandra has called me 4 times. They hired a private investigator to look for you. Irene is spamming your dead email address. They found out the business and the house were sold, and they are in an absolute panic trying to locate the assets." I told Clifford to give them my new email address. I wanted to see what they would say when the mask was finally off. The emails flooded in within an hour. Phillips was dripping with ego, accusing me of being irrational and embarrassing the family by disappearing. Nolan's was defensive, claiming he was terrified for my safety and begging me to call him. Irene tried to use guilt, writing paragraphs about how I was abandoning my grandchildren and breaking her heart. But Sandra took the nuclear route. A week later, a registered letter arrived at Clifford's office from a highly aggressive estate litigation attorney in Boston. The letter used careful, legal terminology, but the threat was crystal clear. Sandra was initiating a process to have my financial decisions reviewed, citing undue influence and concerns of severe cognitive decline. She was trying to have me declared legally incompetent so she could seize control of my estate. Clifford didn't even call me to ask for permission. He immediately fired back a massive legal package. He sent the notarized timeline of my estate liquidation. He sent letters from 2 different independent neurologists confirming my perfect cognitive health. He sent the meticulously sourced ledgers showing the hundreds of thousands of dollars I had secretly paid to keep Philip, Nolan, and Irene afloat over the last decade. He attached a polite but devastating cover letter suggesting that if Sandra's attorney pursued this fraudulent claim any further, Clifford would seek severe sanctions and happily make the secret financial bailouts a matter of public court record. Sandra's attorney withdrew from the matter within 48 hours. The silence that followed was absolute. I sat down at my laptop and wrote one final mass email to my 3 children. I didn't yell. I didn't curse. I told them I was healthy, safe, and living better than I had in a decade. I calmly listed the 10 years of abandonments. I reminded them of the broken wrist, the birthday cake on the porch, and the high school graduation I was turned away from. I told them that the trusts for the grandchildren were locked up tight, and that the rest of my money was mine to spend, donate, or burn as I saw fit. I ended the email by stating that if they genuinely wanted a relationship with their father, I was open to it. But it would be on my terms. They would have to show up consistently, not just when there was an inheritance to protect. Philip replied by calling me a bitter old man. Nolan told me I was being entirely unfair. Irene accused me of punishing the innocent grandchildren. Not a single one of them offered an apology. I closed my laptop, walked out to my garage, and went back to sanding a beautiful oak tabletop. It has been 18 months since I moved to Florida. My life is rich, quiet, and deeply mine. I wake up early, drink coffee on my porch, and head down to the boat launch with my neighbor Harold. I took a significant portion of the money Margaret and I had saved and donated it to a children's literacy foundation in her name. It felt incredible to use that wealth to spread the kind of light she used to bring into the world. Last month, the unexpected happened. I received an email from Irene. It wasn't defensive, it was long, painful, and raw. She told me she had been in intensive therapy for the past year. She explained that her therapist helped her realize something profound. After Margaret died, my children couldn't bear to look at me because my grief was a mirror reflecting their own unbearable loss. They used being busy as a shield to avoid the pain of our broken family. And over the years, that avoidance hardened into pure, selfish entitlement. Irene wrote that she was wrong. She said they were all wrong. She apologized, genuinely and deeply, and asked if I would be willing to schedule a 10-minute phone call, just to hear each other's voices. I have read that email dozens of times. Part of me is fiercely guarded, remembering the cold sting of those 10 empty Thanksgivings. But part of me recognizes the little girl who used to cry when she scraped her knee, the daughter who always felt everything so heavily. I haven't responded yet. Maybe I will write back tomorrow. Maybe I never will. The beautiful thing is that the choice is entirely mine. I am no longer waiting. I am no longer buying groceries for people who will never arrive, and I am no longer leaving the porch light on for ghosts. I am Bernard Owens. I worked hard, loved my wife with every fiber of my being, and survived the ultimate betrayal by the people I created. I walked away with my dignity intact, my finances secure, and my soul finally at peace. If there is one thing I want you to take away from my story, it is this. Loyalty is not a life sentence to abuse. Patience is not the same thing as weakness. At some point, you have the absolute right to stop waiting for people to treat you the way you deserve and simply go build a life that does not require their participation. I spent 10 years of my life being forgotten by my family. I plan on spending whatever time I have left being found by myself